Welcome to OnScript's Biblical World, a podcast exploring the history, archaeology, geography, and cultures of the Bible. Visit us at onscript.study/biblicalworld.
Hey, OnScript listeners, welcome back to the podcast. This is another cross-listed Biblical World podcast episode. Please go over and subscribe to Biblical World wherever you're listening to this podcast. And we've got an episode today with Mark Janzen about his work at the temples at Karnak in Egypt. Super interesting stuff, and I hope you enjoy this. It's hosted by Chris McKinny. Mark and Chris are both co-hosts on the Biblical World podcast. If you're able to support what we're doing here to help get this podcast, this new one, off the ground, go on over to onscript.study/donate, and you can support us monthly, or just give us a rating on iTunes or wherever you listen to the podcast to share the word. We'd appreciate both of those things, and are mostly just grateful for you listening. And we are thrilled by the enthusiasm of so many of you for digging into the world of the Bible, and hope that this podcast is helpful to that end. So we'll be cross-listing the first few episodes on the OnScript feed, and then eventually just directing you over to that podcast, and we'll continue regular programming here at OnScript. We've got some great episodes lined up for that as well. Okay, thanks for listening.
Welcome to the OnScript, the Biblical World podcast. Today I am joined by Dr. Mark Janzen, who is an Egyptologist who works at Louisiana College in Louisiana. And Mark and I go back a bit, maybe for the last 2 or 3 years. We've gotten to know each other and done a couple of different projects together. We've worked on a large volume about the historical geography of the wilderness wanderings and the Exodus, which we'll give you more information about that when the time comes. But Mark and I have enjoyed writing an article on that. And again, we have this book coming up. And Mark has a number of other things that he's worked on, including a very interesting book that's coming out, I think, in the next month or so, on the date of the Exodus. And not so much just one view, but in fact 5 views of the date of the Exodus. And so, Mark, welcome. And I hope we can do this much more as we think about the connections between Egyptology and the biblical world. So, yeah, why don't you go ahead and talk about yourself a bit, and also maybe tell us why it is that you became an Egyptologist in the first place.
Sure. Thanks for having me. I think we'll have a number of productive and engaging conversations here. It's funny you brought up the book. I actually, just before I sat down, I saw this box at my front door, and it's actually my copies of the book, 5 Views on the Exodus is what it's called. And it started out kind of as a lot of chronology, and there is a lot on the date there, but actually the way the book unfolds, it's also about like the historicity of the Exodus, the sort of different philosophical approaches, whether it's literal history or cultural memory. And so, yeah, it's kind of funny that happened to come out right before I got my copies of it, right before I came on here. And it comes out officially April 13th. So, but as for me, I became an Egyptologist in a kind of a wandering journey itself. A lot of people, you ask this, they'll say, oh, I loved Egypt ever since I was a little kid. And while that's true, it's not for me that unique. Like, I loved Rome and Greece and the Old Testament. Like, I loved all the ancient stuff. And I went to Trinity Evangelical Divinity School to get my master's, thinking I'd get an MA in Old Testament. I took one archaeology class with Jim Hoffmeyer that first semester, absolutely loved it, and saw so much value in how he was able to contextualize Scripture and bring up all these things I'd never even heard of, and then he would have us read different sides of the debate, and I saw, oh wow, there's a real need for educated people who are willing to engage in this data, for both, as far as the academic world goes, but also in trying to explain it to a larger audience, which very few of us do. And then, he just kind of talked to me about doing Egyptology for my PhD work as you kind of get, more specific. And I took a semester of Akkadian, thought, nope, back to hieroglyphs I shall go. As soon as it got into chicken scratch, I was like, I can't memorize all this. This is for someone way smarter than me.
You need pictures.
Yeah, I need pictures, and exactly. Big pictures and then little captions, and that's as far as I want to read. And that's what epigraphy is. No, so it was just a good fit for me, and I've always loved all the ancient history, really. But it's funny. You specialize in your doctorate, right? You get as specific as possible. I'm like, okay, I am second half of the new kingdom in Egypt, and then it's like, oh, we need you to be a generalist anytime you teach. So I'm glad I love all of ancient history, because it's served me well.
Yeah, that's the key is that you have to be able to connect this to a relevant historical background, and oftentimes when you end up teaching just such a wide variety of things in whatever institution you end up in, and so it's good to love it all, but love something the most, which hopefully is what you do your dissertation and your PhD on. Well, I would say congratulations about the book. And there's nothing like getting that parcel on your front door of freshly printed book with your name on it.
Yeah, it was pretty
so
cool.
Congratulations.
Pretty surreal at the first.
And we'll have to put the link in the description so people can have access to it. And hopefully, in the coming weeks, we'll be able to actually have a conversation with several of the authors who have presented their case about the date and the historicity of the Exodus, especially as we get closer and closer to Passover and Easter itself. And so that's really exciting, and congratulations for that.
Yeah, thanks again.
Yeah, so one of the things that I think you kind of touched on a bit, and I think is an important part of just biblical study in general. I mean, this podcast is about biblical backgrounds. It's about connections with archaeology, language, and so on. And then Egyptology itself is just such a humongous field. You have just this civilization that's so rich and full. It's so visual. It spans thousands of years. And in and of itself, it's just fascinating. And then you don't even have to bring the Bible in it to be fascinated by it. But once you add in the fact that so much of what we read in the Bible, really throughout the whole Old Testament Hebrew Bible, and even into the New Testament, it's really interesting that in the book of Matthew, we have Jesus and Mary and Joseph going down into Egypt. Just so much of it is connected with Egypt. And one of the things that I think scholarship often will focus on is the connections with Mesopotamia, which are very obvious when you open up and read Genesis 1 through 11 especially. And of course, there's many Mesopotamian connections. But the Egyptological connections are often seen as not being as significant, but they are. They're very important. And the thing I've appreciated about your work and the things that we've done together, as well as some of the mentors that you mentioned, is that they've been able to make that relevance between the Egyptological background and the Bible. And so if you have even some examples, or you want to elaborate on that, please do.
So I like to lead this with something that's just kind of funny that I think really brings home the point. Egypt is so phenomenally ancient that when Jesus, Mary, and Joseph are in Egypt when he's a boy, the pyramids are roughly 2,500 years old. That means they are older to his time than his time on earth is to our time by 500 years. And I think that speaks to part of the issue when it comes to Egyptology and the Bible, and why only with I guess James Henry Breasted and Wilson and a few of those early Egyptologists did it, but it didn't really become a big part of the scholarship until like Kenneth Kitchen and Jim Hoffmeyer was one of my own mentors, and those guys started to really dive in deeply. And it's just there's so much data from Egypt that many Egyptologists were too busy just sorting out all the Egyptian data that they didn't even want to touch anything involving the Hebrew Old Testament. And then, of course, there's all the firestorm of debates about certain topics too. But I do think that's changing some, as I mentioned with Kenneth Kitchen, Jim Hoffmeyer. there's several, Michael Hosel does some work there, or at least on topics that can relate to both. Or someone like David Falk, I know you're familiar with his really good book on the tabernacle. So I hope that picture will continue to change, because I think the elephant in the room here is a philosophical issue, which is, if you subscribe to the idea that the Old Testament is largely written late, which I personally don't, then you're looking for all these Mesopotamian parallels. But if you find all these Egyptian parallels, especially in the Pentateuch, what do you do with them if it's all written late? And so I think there was sort of a head in the sand aspect here about not really examining the Egyptian data, because that then suggests to you that there are at least kernels of truth in authentic Egyptian isms in the Pentateuch. Makes kind of hard to believe that it's all written later in Babylon, to kind of quickly try to generalize on that. So I think the value of studying Egypt, of course, extends past the Exodus event or the wilderness wanderings. Of course, they're mentioned several times in historical books, whether we're talking about Necho or Pharaoh's daughter marrying Solomon and all those kinds of things. So I think any culture's background should be treated equally in terms of trying to understand their impact on the Old Testament and on ultimately the development of Israel, both as a people and then ultimately a nation.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that there's just a number of important lines of discussion that need to be had, and I think it's encouraging to see that there are scholars on kind of across the spectrum willing to see these deep connections, especially between a book like the Book of Exodus and the Egyptian material. You pointed to David Falk's recent book, which I think is absolutely fantastic, The Ark of the Covenant, and it's in Egyptian context. And Ra'anan Eichler from Bar Ilan University has done a similar type of thing, looking at King Tut's furniture and things along those lines to draw out and make connections with the Ark of the Covenant. And maybe we'll talk about those in future episodes, but I think they're very, very significant. And the other thing, I really like your point about it being 2,500 years, and I thought, we're in 2021 now. Maybe by 2,500, the Cowboys or the Bears will actually win another Super Bowl.
Yes.
It might take that long. I'm a Cowboys fan, and
at
Mark
some
is
point,
a Bears
it's bound
fan.
to happen. Oh man.
Yeah.
I do think it's
long
worth
suffering.
Yeah, I think it is worth reiterating, just to be totally clear. The picture is definitely changing, and pretty substantially, about Egypt in the Bible, or scholars looking at these comparisons, or even something like the Canaanites influenced the Israelites, and then the Canaanites are in turn influenced by New Kingdom Egypt, right? So I think it's getting much better, but I do think you can see a gap there prior to, say, the last 30, 40 years.
Yeah, and I think the other thing about it is that you're seeing it more with people that don't have a skin in the game. In other words, you're seeing it not with strictly conservative evangelical circles saying, yeah, these connections are there. You're seeing, of course you have that, but you're seeing it with Egyptologists that aren't necessarily biblical scholars, don't have faith commitments and that type of thing, which when you have that as kind of an outer picture or an outer way of looking at the evidence, makes it, I think, all the more legitimate and something to really pay careful attention to. So let's transition a bit and let's talk about the project that you are a part of. I'll let you give the full name of it, but it's connected with the temple at Karnak, which those of you who have not been to the Temple of Karnak, you've not been to what I think is probably the most impressive site in the ancient Near East, if you want to include Egypt in the ancient Near East. It's just a phenomenal site. I mean, I remember visiting it for the first time, and you go into the Hypostyle hall, and you need 7 or 8 people to wrap around one of these columns. It's just an unbelievable experience, and from what I understand, you get to spend whole weeks of your summer staring at the scratchings on the walls. Can you give us some insight into what the project is in general, and what your specific role is in that?
Yeah, so we actually moved the project to the winter because there's not enough shade at our wall in the summer, and it was like, our workday is like 6 a.m. to 10:30. Let's change the season here. Karnak is the biggest ancient temple ever built. You can put Notre Dame inside it 4 times over. I mean, it's just enormous. When I take people to Egypt, they know about it because like they're going with me, so it's sort of a no-brainer. But then they finally see it, they're like, wow, this is even more stupendous than the pyramids. Plus, you can do a lot more at Karnak. And so I think it doesn't get the press it maybe should. But our project is the Karnak Great Hypostyle Hall project, under the direction of Peter Brand, who I studied doing my doctoral work at the University of Memphis. I studied under, I should say. And we've maintained a great relationship. And he invited me to the project to expand it to cover the western exterior wall of the Cour de la Cachette, which is right there up against the Hypostyle Hall. And so we kind of we're sort of around the corner from it. And then, every morning when we walk in, you can see the sun rising like among the columns, and it's like, I work here. It's kind of a crazy thought that I have for those few weeks a year that we're in season. And we'll put a link in, I think, for the website for the overall project for sure in the description, hosted by the University of Memphis. But the project as a whole is trying to scientifically record and preserve everything in the Hypostyle Hall that's inscribed, right? Whether it's the columns themselves, which, as you said, are absolutely massive, or whether it's the walls, which are every square inch is basically decorated that has survived, or even the architraves, like you look up and you're like, oh, there's another cartouche up there. And then my project is doing the same thing with this wall that's actually very heavily exposed. So a lot of the Hypostyle Hall has some shade, at least, whereas mine's just out there, sun, wind, there's no protection for the wall. And I think that heightens the value of it, I guess you could say, as at least we're trying to give everybody for the rest of human history a precise recordation of the wall as it was in 2020, let's say, roughly. So it's an epigraphy project, to be clear. It is not archaeological at this point, really, at all. So that's the broad overview of
Great.
what
Yeah, maybe I can ask some more specific questions about that, and maybe I can try to internalize this for our listeners also. So the Hypostyle Hall is like one of the main parts of Karnak Temple. It's the most impressive thing that you see. And what your project is connected with Pharaoh Merneptah, and I know we've had this conversation before. You can say Cour de la Cachette if you want to sound French, right. Or you can can sound like you're from the southern part of the United States and call it Cachette, Cour de la Cachette. So however you like, that's what you are specifically working on, and so I think that's really clear. But what's not necessarily clear is in terms of why that there's a need for it, because from my understanding, there is this epigraphic survey has been done, but it was done, from what I understand, just using site drawings, whereas now you're bringing in all kinds of high resolution elements, and so maybe you can elaborate on that, and then the follow-up question to that would be, have there been times already where you've seen a difference? Because another thing that I think is important for people to think about is it's not only important to do this, do you get results immediately, but you're recording something that can then be manipulated in many varieties of ways moving forward in terms of how technology is going to develop. And so you're creating a type of data source that is invaluable not only now, but going down the line. And so my main question is, are there things that you've seen already that you've changed between the original epigraphic surveys and what you see now? And then the second question is, potentially looking to the future, if we could get in Doc Brown's DeLorean and go to 2500, and maybe when Karnak is destroyed, maybe there's an ISIS that starts up and it's destroyed, or it's completely weathered. What are maybe some things that we might be able to say in the future? And again, maybe that's a little bit guesswork, but I bet you probably thought about some of those things before. Yeah.
So I'll just speak to my wall now, the western wall of the Cachette, and I think what I love about epigraphy is it's both the old and the new. It's a collision of worlds, right? We're studying ancient material with new technology that is really changing how it's done. Even the University of Chicago house, who they've done epigraphy for over 100 years at the absolute top level, are like, okay, we don't have to do it the way we've always done it thanks to digital, epigraphy. And that's really what we're doing now is digital epigraphy. So for us, maybe just to give you a quick look at the process, it started with taking high-res, high-def photos all along the wall the first year. And these have to be taken at the ideal lighting condition. You don't just show up in the morning and just start photographing. For us, that was really 12:30 to 1:30 every day. It was photo time. And that's when the sun is kind of off to the side of the wall, but still fairly high up, of course. And it provides a perfect, we call it a raking light. It's almost like taking a font and putting it in bold. So lines that are faint, you can see better and things like that. And then we, take every few, you just take 400 pictures, and then you put those 400 pictures through software that stitches it together and makes an ortho photo. And from there, our work really begins, because then we take that into Illustrator or Photoshop, depending on your comfort level with either, and you trace it. Then you take it the next season, you take that drawing back into the field and you collate it in person, making notes about what you got wrong, or what, maybe that line needs to be a little rounder, or that's sharper, or whatever. And so the digital epigraphy allows us to then just go back in, load up the file, move the vector points, or tweak the line instead of starting a whole new drawing. So I think it's allowing us to have the same level of detail, but in much less time. And I hope that kind of idea takes off for the field, because we could get a lot more recorded and preserved quicker as a result. And then the second part of your question, if I remember right, is what have we seen that's already different than what was previously published? So on the wall that I work on, the only publications were not really epigraphic surveys even. They were just people like Rosinski drawing it at the wall. We don't even know if he had ladders or scaffolding. Right. And you have to understand, if you took a photo at the wrong angle, it's going to distort the data that you could get. If you're looking up 20 feet from the ground, there's things you're going to miss. Right. To actually be scientific, your view has to be square with good lighting all the time, which is also why we don't just take a photo, publish it, and move on with our lives, because the photos automatically, even the best photo, introduces some distortion. So probably the main thing that we've found that people hadn't realized was just how many palimpsests there were from the Battle of Kadesh. A palimpsest is a scene underneath a scene. And so this is where it gets really fun, because it's like detective work. And we found several horses that some had been drawn, some had not, and dozens of the side profile of an unfinished Egyptian soldier. Dozens of them, register lines of them, that were probably from the scene Ramses started to celebrate on our wall from Kadesh, the camping scene or something. And then he didn't like that it went around the corner and didn't have room, so he scrapped the whole idea. But traces of the chisel marks still remain, and we see a lot more than anyone had actually suspected.
Well, this is really cool. And that kind of leads me into my next question. But thinking about how being able to see beyond what your eyes can see on these sites and things that people have never seen before because they've not had the technology to do that is really interesting. I mean, I'm not an Egyptologist, but I've watched Egyptological documentaries and things like that. But I think they've done some of this. I think even I watched a recent one on Amazon Prime where they were comparing King Tut's funerary material and how it was co-opted from, I believe it was his sister who became his wife. If you remember the name, feel free to add it. But it's kind of the same thing where you kind of, when you look at the material, you can actually see below what the final representation was, and it gives the telltale signs of the original production. So it sounds like that's very interesting. And the other thing I'd say is, in terms of the context, we haven't really talked about how or what you're actually looking at. I mean, the method that you're describing can be really on anything that is epigraphic or a pictorial relief on a wall, from Assyria to Egypt and everywhere in between. But the relevance of what you're doing is that we're talking about the very pharaoh, Merneptah, who mentions Israel for the first time in a text in the Merneptah Stele. And what you just mentioned, in the case of Ramses, and perhaps this scene of the Battle of Kadesh, this is extremely important not only for world history, but perhaps has a definitive role to play in dating the context and background of specific texts in the book of Exodus. There's been such scholars, as you know, as Josh Berman and Hoffmeyer and others who've pointed to comparisons between the scenes that we have of Ramses and basically describing it on every one of his big temples, as well as the actual poem and the bulletin text itself. So this is potentially, you're getting double, right? You're getting Ramses and those connections, but also the definitive one with Merneptah and kind of reassessing all of that. It's very cool not to just have a description of any old pharaoh, but a pharaoh that is directly related to biblical studies because of the connection with the so-called Merneptah Stele. And if you have anything else to add, like what is actually on this scene and how can it relate to what we see on the Merneptah Stele? I know there's a lot of discussion, but maybe you can give us a general overview of what you see on this wall, the Cour de la Cachette or Cachette, and what you have on the Merneptah Stele.
Okay, so buckle up. This will be a little longer probably answer. I'm going to take us back to the adjacent wall, which is the south exterior wall of the Hypostyle Hall, where we have same palimpsests of Ramses from Kadesh, and they round the corner onto quote-unquote my wall, which is just easier to say. And then otherwise, on the south wall, Ramses put just kind of a smattering of his wars in Syria, Palestine. And so then he starts the Kadesh campaign. He puts his name at the top of the wall in a great big bando text, which is still there in the corner. And then at some point he must have said, I don't like how this looks with it rounding the corner. Maybe a scribe or artisan had a real bad day at that point. And he scraps the whole thing. And then he puts about 10, 12 feet from the corner of the wall, maybe a little further, he puts the Hittite peace treaty, which is the next big thing for him to celebrate. You know, it really doesn't want to go for Kadesh round 2. And so that's his thing to celebrate. We think he then plasters over the incomplete scene, and now the treaty will stick out from the wall and kind of pop real nice. Well, he dies. Finally, Merneptah succeeds him, has his wars in Western Asia, and is looking for a place to celebrate them in the Hypostyle Hall or the environs around it, as what good Ramesside rulers do. But he's not one of the rulers who's going to say, well, I'll just steal my predecessors. He's got too much respect for dear old dad and Grandpa Seti. And the only space available, as far as he can tell, is to the left and right of the peace treaty. And that's what he does. He puts his wars in Western Asia on either side of the peace treaty. After all, Ramses didn't finish Kadesh, so he's not usurping anything. And if you go just right of the peace treaty, you have the only toponym that survives on our wall, which is Ishkarina for Ashkelon. Plain as day. Beautiful scene. It's the big centerpiece.
And that's the one that has the attack, and that's possibly, it's been suggested as a possible scene of child sacrifice. I don't know if it actually is, but it shows the one.
The little guy. There's actually one on the south end that's badly damaged, too. That happens a couple times on our wall. So people are trying to figure out that interpretation there. But Ashkelon is definitely... Merneptah wants us to focus on it based on where he puts it on the wall. And then the other places attacked, we don't have a name for on the wall. But there's a fortified settlement on the lower register on the left of the Hittite treaty, and on the upper register, a different fortified settlement. So we've got Ashkelon and then two places. And then above Ashkelon, there's an open field battle, and only from the waist down on the participants. That's the only portion that survives, so there's nothing really to give us good ethnic markers. If you know of a way to tell who these people are by their feet, by all means, let me know. There's nothing in their sandals that looks indicative of who they are. They do have a chariot somehow, whoever they are. And then on the far right of the wall, as you're looking at it, then he brings everybody back, and then it all breaks off. And there's probably some loose blocks in the courtyard, and we know a couple of them. And the French team that work on the inner part of the wall are actually restoring some on the outer part. That's an ongoing project, so that's kind of cool because we'll get to redo photos and everything when they get a couple of them put in. But that's the wall in the broad overview. And so if you bring it now to the Israel Stela, of course, he mentions right off the bat Ashkelon, Gesher, Yenoam, and then Israel. And so that's led to a lot of debate and a pretty hotly contested one ever since Frank Yurko proposed, and he was right about this part, that these reliefs were actually Merneptah's and never Ramses. And the cartouches that survive are badly damaged, but they contain traces of Merneptah's name and his successor Seti II. They do not show a hint of Ramses' name other than the bando at the very top, which is a whole separate thing. And we've actually got my doctoral student, Terry Nichols, and I, he's my techie guy, too. He's great help. We have an article coming out in the Digital Egyptology book that came out of a conference at the Indiana University where we analyzed the cartouches with photogrammetry, where we turned the picture on the side and checked the depths. And basically, it's not scooped out enough to account for more usurpations. So that's just another reason to think Ramses' name was never there. So Yurko says, hey, this is all Merneptah's. Kitchen himself is actually convinced by it and puts it in a footnote, like in Retonk later, like, oh yeah, I said this was Ramses back in the day, but it's not. It's Merneptah. I'm convinced. Right. And then Peter Brand and others, it's really clinched at this point that it's Merneptah. The controversy comes in, who are these top people with just the legs? Because if you've got Ashkelon, Gesher, and Yenoam, well, what's the obvious temptation?
Starts with an I.
Yeah, and I'm not comfortable going there because I don't want to just read my wall in light of Merneptah's Stela.
Right.
But we also know of no other campaign of his in this region. And the Stela is more properly about the Libyans. The Libyans are on the other side of the wall in the court, right? Which would be more prestigious, which syncs up with him voting way more lines in the Stela to the Libyans. So I think we are getting a pretty complete picture there, but hard to say who these other people are. But at any rate, it's definitely the pharaoh who mentions Israel for the first time, and it's his only real battle scene. So
yeah, what's so interesting about these is you see during this period, and it really reminds me also of what you have in Assyria to some extent, in the Neo-Assyrian period, where you would have lengthy inscriptions that are royal inscriptions describing their various battles, but then those would then be used in the texts as they would write them on wax tablets or other types of documents. They would then be used as a kind of plan to put on various walls of temples and palaces. And so it's just really interesting when you see, at least in this case, you have the question of how do you relate an artifact like the Merneptah or Israel Stele to this wall, which seems to have all of these really interesting connections with Ashkelon and perhaps with Israel, as Anson Rainey and Yurko have suggested, although they differ in their opinion on this stuff. But it does make sense based upon what you see in the wider world, not only in Egypt, but in other parts where you have big reliefs with pictures of cities. It's always nice when the name is preserved right beside it to help us out. You know, it also reminded me of I'm a huge Tolkien nerd, and so when I was reading one of his more recent ones, I think it may have been The Children of Hurin or something along those lines. And in the opening line, he talks about having to read back through his father's, J.R.R. Tolkien's writings, and he's having to go read it sideways and read it upside down because he would write and not waste any paper. So he's trying to pull off earlier versions of The Hobbit and earlier versions of these different accounts, and it's the same guy that you're looking at over his lifetime as he recycled these things. And how much more complicated is it when you're talking about multiple generations of pharaohs sharing and then defacing and then reshaping it to make what they want it to look like. And it's just also fascinating. It's this really big jigsaw puzzle. We often like to talk about in archaeology that it's kind of like putting a puzzle together, except 95% of the puzzle pieces are missing and the box is also gone. But we have a vague idea of how somebody put it together, so maybe we could put it this way. Here, you've got maybe most of the puzzle pieces, but it's all jumbled up, and all the puzzle designers themselves couldn't agree on what it looked like.
Yeah, exactly. Well said. And we got a lot of the puzzle because of the battle scenes, but we don't have a couple of the key pieces of the details. Like the dream would be, we find some blocks, they allow excavations at some point, and then there's an inscribed block with a toponym on it. That's like, gotta go on our wall, and it's like, hey, that one's, like that would be awesome. Even better if it had Israel on it. That would be crazy. And then there'd be like, oh, it's a forge. You can imagine the reaction to that. But I think at some point too, on the Israel thing, I want the wall to speak for itself. And so I'm not going to like call it clinched that's that. And I think Yurko and Rainey maybe overstated the case there. At the same time, at some point, if you can't advocate for another group, then who is it? You know what I mean? Like, it's one thing to tear apart an argument and be like, well, there's no definitive evidence. That's all true. But what's the other option here? Not linking it up with the Stila, which seems wrong. Some other just vague Canaanites that he doesn't mention, very much possible. But that's pretty much it. Those are really your only options if you're playing around in Western Asia. If you want to sync it up to the Stila, which, again, I think you should be based on the other knowledge of his reign that we have. Which leads me to another point in trying to interpret it. And one of my future goals years down the road is to try to write a sort of definitive historical biography of Merneptah, kind of like Kitchen's Pharaoh Triumphant. Because I feel like to answer some of this, I need to get to know Merneptah better somehow.
Right.
So
no, that sounds really interesting.
A lot of layers to that whole thing.
So really the stakes are here that we already have the earliest reference to Israel and the Merneptah Stele without going into the Berlin pedestal and that whole discussion.
Which I think are not. But yeah.
And I've read recently that there's some suggesting now that it's even 13th century also. But leaving that aside, what potentially you could have on this wall is a picture, the earliest picture of Israel depicted. But again, it's not definitive, and the question is if it's depicting a Canaanite or an Israelite. And again, there's a follow-up question: is what's the difference?
Yeah, that's true.
That's a whole other discussion.
At that time, that's my joke about the feet, right? It's like, well, what would the wall be able to do for us here unless we get the toponym or the people name or something on a block somewhere?
Yeah, but definitely exciting things. And the other thing I wanted to ask you is about excavations at Karnak itself. You mentioned that it would be great to excavate again. Were there actual excavations of the wall, or in some ways it's always been up like it is now to some extent because it's such a massive structure. But
they had
that
to
area
remove sand. I don't know if I would call that an excavation. Now the French team that are helping with the block restoration, which I leave to them. They're marvelous at that. I wouldn't want to touch that. It'd be fun to help put it together, but the physical doing it, correctly is great that they're able to do that. They actually have been able to dig a trench a little ways out from the wall in the last year or so, but I haven't been back since, so I'll be curious to see if anything comes of that. But that's just part of their sort of solidifying the foundation. And if they happen to find something, that would just be a bonus. Our overall bigger project has gotten permission 1 year to use ground penetrating radar to check for square blocks, like anything that looks like, a person made this, and in the court, in the actual Hypostyle hall itself. And we're hoping 1 year that they'll let us do that out at our wall. But the officials, and I can see why, they don't want a lot of digging around by the wall for fear of it toppling. And so I think it's pretty hard to get that kind of a permission, but we'll see.
Yeah, and it's really interesting. You mentioned that Karnak is probably the most impressive site in really all of the ancient Near East, at least in terms of its architecture and the amount of inscriptions that are there. And it's kind of, there's an interesting parallel, I would say, with what you have in Jerusalem, where you can excavate the Temple Mount, and you can't really do much with it other than observe architectural changes from the outside. Where in the case of Karnak, potentially you could excavate alongside these fine blocks that have fallen off over the years, and presumably, if they fell off early, would be very well preserved as they lie face down in the sand. But who's to say there's not earlier structures directly beneath that are on completely different lines that lie uninvestigated. And so it's another way of even thinking about really what is out there in terms of what we don't know, what hasn't been found. And that's exciting. I remember when I was an undergrad student reading about Albright, William Foxwell Albright, famous biblical archaeologist, opining that all the discoveries were going to be made before he would get old enough and have his PhD to go find them himself. Well, here we are 100 years gone, and there's much, much, much more still waiting. And there will always be a need to continue to investigate these things. One thing I did kind of want to swing around to so that our listeners are aware of is you mentioned the Hittite treaty of Ramses II. This is a very significant treaty, and I won't go into all the ins and outs of that, but it's actually preserved in a couple of different forms. One is, of course, the Egyptian version, and then the Hittite version, which was found at the capital of the Kingdom of Hatti. This was the Hittites of the Late Bronze Age. We're talking about in the 13th century, and they have the top part of this treaty, which actually existed in silver plates, probably in the palace and temples of both Ramses and in Hatti. But it turns out that the Egyptian version is much more complete. And one of the interesting connections about the treaty from the Egyptian side of things is it actually includes the blessings and the cursings that play a role in the debate about the dating of the Book of Deuteronomy that Kenneth Kitchen and many other scholars have pointed to. And so in some ways, the most important feature of that wall is the one that Ramses left in this Hittite treaty, which is so interesting in part of this whole discussion about the dating of covenant and the covenant features, such as the historical prologue and especially those blessings and cursings. And so anyway, I just wanted to highlight that because people may not be aware that when they eventually are able to visit places like Karnak, there's a number of very important things to look at, even on the wall that you're describing.
Yeah, it's kind of wild to think that we have the Hittite treaty, hopefully, that we get to start working on soon, and then something that probably connects to Merneptah Stele. I mean, that's two of the most important historical documents from all of Egyptian history. So definitely blessed indeed.
Definitely, and very exciting stuff. Well, let me shift gears a bit, and then as we end, what are some of the problems that you see among biblical scholars with regards to their lack of knowledge of Egyptology? What are some issues that you see there that you could address?
I think this one I'll say is about to kind of for both fields until, again, fairly recently, and I think it is changing for the positive. Both fields are a little too insular. As I mentioned already, Egyptologists have kind of been like, well, we've got so much data to sort of our own. But the ancient world wasn't that insular, right? Like, and now, so there's a lot more coming out of the late bronze connections and even earlier eras. So I think that's starting to change. For biblical scholars specifically, I think I'm just going to give you two things to not take forever here. Number one, don't be so wedded to old theories about the composition of the text, especially speaking to the Pentateuch or the Deuteronomistic history, that you shy away from the Egyptological clues in the text, like the loan words in the birth of Moses, right? The reed basket, the rushes on the river, right? These are totally borrowed from Egypt. That needs to be explained. And if you're too committed a priori to, a late date or something along those lines, those can be like weird things to try to account for, but they're there. And so let's let the text speak for itself and consult all the compranda and not just have that previous commitment. But again, I think it has gotten somewhat better, but it's still an old idea that dies very slowly, I think. And then secondly, I think the idea of Egyptian ideology is sometimes key ideas in Egyptian ideology are sometimes misunderstood by biblical scholars. So, for example, Ma'at, right, as the fundamental undergirding principle of pharaonic behavior, is a really important thing to keep in mind. And the idea of ideology and propaganda in the first place, for the Egyptians, propaganda only served a purpose if it was rooted in something in the past. And yes, they could embellish it and then just blow it completely out of proportion to fit their ideological agendas. But they didn't usually just make it up whole cloth, right? And so like we hear propaganda or ideology and they're almost like have a negative connotation that I don't think fits the Egyptian mindset at all. And then I would say, on a related note, when it comes to something, so that's one big point. The second big point, I guess, would be understand that Egyptian history isn't monolithic to the degree that I think it's sort of assumed like, oh, well, the Egyptians would never do X, Y, or Z because they didn't in the 18th dynasty. They must never do it in the wake of the New Kingdom. You're talking 400 years later. A great example of this is the idea that Solomon marries an Egyptian princess. Oh, well, the Egyptians don't do that. Right, in their heyday, but right now they're weak and they're looking for an alliance and diplomacy, and it's just some basic stuff that historians understand about continuity and change. And yet I see people who are usually from the skeptical side of things when it comes to the Bible's historical value constantly repeating these old refrains about, oh, they wouldn't do this, they wouldn't do this. That's only based on Amenhotep II's text 400 years earlier, right? Like any historian would be like, well, hang on, what's your 400 years? You've got to prove your steps of transmission down to that now era to make that claim. And it's just thrown out there like it's Egyptian. It must have all been the same. And I think there's a lot more change than people think on things like that.
Yeah, I think a good parallel to this is like, okay, what do Christians think about baptism between the years 1 AD to 400, or any other period, or even if we said from 1500 AD to today? What do they think about baptism? Right. Which Christians? Who are you talking about? And I think that historical context is so vital to get to those nitty gritty discussions. But the problem is in really archaeology in general, but Egyptology also, is even with the wealth that exists, oftentimes your closest parallel in terms of an event to comparing it to the Bible may be centuries earlier or centuries later. And so you're still left with having to try and make these connections. But I think what you're getting at, and I would agree, is that there needs to be a healthy level of doubt or skepticism that your conclusion that because Amenhotep II did it at the end of the 15th, beginning of the 14th century, so therefore it applies to Solomon in the middle of the 10th century. It just doesn't necessarily have to be that way. So
right, you got to do a lot more to demonstrate that than just repeat the quote. So it was just one example that sprung to mind.
Yeah, that's good. Thank you.
All right, thank you. It's been great.
You've been listening to OnScript's Biblical World podcast. If you enjoy this show, please show your support by giving us a rating on iTunes or wherever you listen. You can support the show by visiting onscript.study/donate. Until next time, keep digging.